Let's all go through a quick visualization and recall exercise. I want you to close your eyes, jog your memory, and imagine as vividly as you can, as if it just happened this morning. Remember that time when you were sat at that desk, seconds away from taking this one exam that was going to determine your future? Or remember that time when you were in the finals of that one event, you're taking one last look at the opponents, and one last look back at the start clock, just waiting for it to start. Or remember that time when you were standing backstage, your turn is coming up next, and you're rehearsing everything in your mind one last time. Now, I bet that even if you haven't experienced any of these events, I bet that at the moment, your heart rate started beating a little faster. You got that sinking feeling in your stomach. And you started having these negative thoughts, and you started thinking, what if I mess up in front of everyone? You started thinking about how you might let your loved ones down. It is precisely this feeling of nervousness and anxiousness that reduces our performances in high-stakes situations. Despite months of practice, we still experience this phenomenon. And even professional athletes who have decades of experience still experience this phenomenon. But what is the science behind this choking? Why does anxiety reduce our performance? And how can we stop it? Because if we can find a solution, every one of us would benefit, from the high school student taking their final exam to the final penalty kick taker in the World Cup finals. What started me down this journey is my own personal experience at a time when my nervousness ruined my performance. I was a competitive swimmer when I was younger. And during one of the events that I attended, it was another swimming meet, another tournament. It was at an unfamiliar venue, much larger than what I was used to. And as you can see, it had an almost stadium-like feel. I started to feel a bit uneasy, but I couldn't quite identify what I was feeling at the time. Now, swimmers have this certain ritual that they have to go through before they begin a race. So they stand along the standing blocks. The referee will whistle. They get up on the standing block. The referee will say, "Take your marks." You get into position. And once you hear the electronic beep is when you can jump into the water and start the race. So I went through the usual motions, got close to the standing block, heard the whistle. I got up on it. I heard the referee say, "Take your marks." I got into position. And then, splash. I fell into the water before the beep had gone off. And for those of you who don't know, this is an automatic disqualification. I go home, I don't do the race. I was devastated. I didn't know how I was going to explain this to my poor mom who drove me all the way here. And as I was trying to come up of some excuse, some justification, as soon as I got in the car, before I could even say anything, she asked me one question. "Did you feel nervous when you got up on that block?" And that kick-started our conversation about how nervousness can affect how we perform. And it started to make me wonder, how can I prevent this from happening in future events, whether it be in swimming or in my academic career? And as I went on through life, I noticed that this phenomena affects every single one of us, to varying degrees, but it does affect everyone. I've seen brilliant colleagues in workplaces that would solve complex problems with brilliant solutions, but yet when we meet the higher-ups the next day, they struggle and fumble to get their words out, not the same way that they were doing it to me yesterday. And I've seen university students who were brilliant, with perfect GPAs, excellent resumes, and they would always be invited for postgraduate interviews, and yet they don't receive the offer in the end. The first time, the second time, the third time, which just shows you how powerful this effect can be. So when scientists or psychologists began to study it, they don't study anxiety in isolation and how it affects performance. Rather, they study the whole effect that we get, both physically and mentally, the stimulation that we get in high-stakes situations. So the first theory that they came up with was the drive theory. It simply says that, well, this is actually a good thing because in this increase of stimulation, our body and mind become more ready and become more alert, and so we should technically be performing even better the more stimulated we get. So take, for example, Billy. a high school student preparing for for a presentation in front of his class next week. When he's alone in the room, practicing by himself, he's not really focused, he's getting easily distracted, he starts scrolling on his phone, and so his performance would be a bit down there because he's not very stimulated. But then when he practiced with his best friend Sam, he's a bit more alert, he's a bit more focused, and he starts to actually do a good presentation. Yet on the day of the actual event, or on the day of the actual presentation, Sam had his best performance yet, even better than when they were practicing together, but Billy had a performance so bad it was close to when he was practicing on his own. So clearly there's a deficiency in the drive theory. And even intuitively, we know that at some point, that too much increase in this stimulation or anxiety is going to reduce our performance at some point. So the next theory that psychologists came up with was the inverted U hypothesis. Shaped like a bell curve, simply says that, well, it's still true that in the beginning or at the early levels of stimulation, we're not as engaged, so we don't perform as well. And then it keeps increasing, but only up to a certain point. And any stimulation past that, it starts to hinder our performance. And that's precisely what happened to Billy. But then this doesn't explain what happened to Sam. It doesn't explain why Sam had his best performance yet when he was actually doing the presentation in front of the class. And in fact, this model ignores a whole subset of population that we know thrive under high-pressure situations. And in fact, in society today, there are entire careers dedicated to these types of people. Think of firefighters, think of trauma surgeons. They need to be at their best, at their peak performance in the highest of pressure situations, because it's life or death. So the final theory or the final model to come out, and the one that is most comprehensive, is the individual zones of optimal functioning. That is to say that for each individual person, if we compare ourselves for one certain task, everyone is going to have a different peak somewhere, a different peak for performance somewhere along the stimulation levels. So for example, Billy would be somewhere around the middle, Sam would be somewhere around towards the end. What's interesting is that the researchers who came up with this theory went even further. And they said that for a single person, across different tasks, they will have different individual zones of optimal functioning. So Billy, for example, while he struggles in public speech, he might be a really good musician, or he can play a musical instrument in front of a large crowd with no problem at all. But what is the reason then behind all of this variety? Why do we have different individual zones of optimal functioning between ourselves and within ourselves? There are two ways through which we experience anxiety, or through which anxiety can affect us. The first one is trait anxiety, and that just describes how each person's own personality, own experiences shape how or the level of anxiety they feel in situations. State anxiety refers to the situations themselves. There are certain situations that when anyone is faced with, it increases their level of stimulation or anxiety. And the complex interactions between both is what gives us this wide variety between all of us in individual zones of optimal functioning. But so what? How can we make sense of all this? How does this help any of us now perform better the next time we're feeling a little pressure? Well, research is mixed, and it's not clear if we can influence trait anxiety or state anxiety. And it's not clear if we can actually change our individual zone of optimal functioning for a certain task. So the most obvious solution, the intuitive one, is then, well, if I can identify my own individual zone of optimal functioning for a particular task, anytime I feel myself feeling overstimulated, a little anxious, past my peak, where the peak of my performance would be, I would use self-soothing techniques to try to return to my optimal level. So you could do like the hugging yourself, breathing techniques, and similar techniques. But as a medical student, I've learned that it's good to treat the symptoms, but it's even better to treat the underlying cause. And the way anxiety affects performance, the underlying cause itself, is through two mechanisms. The first one being the processing efficiency theory. It simply says that when we worry, it takes a part of our mental capacity, and that's why we perform worse. So for example, if you're worried during a test, if you're feeling under pressure, it will take a part of your brain power and it won't help you, it will hinder your performance on that test. The second theory was the attentional control theory. And it simply says that when we worry, we lose the ability to focus. And so we start to zoom out and we get overstimulated by different stimuli or by different distractions. For example, a basketball player playing in a huge stadium for the first time might start worrying, and they get the crowd, the noise, the lights, the colors start to make him unable to focus on the person he should be guarding. So the common theme between them is the worrying part. The psychologist then took a look at this and said, well, it was never about the level of stimulation we're feeling. It's more about how we're interpreting it. So if we flip that, if we reverse it, as it's called the reversal theory, we will perform better. So simply, if we start interpreting the anxiety and this heightened stimulation that we feel both physically and mentally as excitement rather than nervousness, and if we start to think of positive outcomes rather than negative outcomes, our performance will also increase. And I'm happy to confirm that a recent review about the use of reversal theory with athletes has shown results, has shown good results. It does take practice. It won't show up at once. It takes time to unlearn the negative thinking that we're used to. But it does bring results, and it will increase performance regardless of where the individual zone of optimal functioning is. So the next time you find yourself in that waiting room, waiting for them to call your name next because it's your interview, rather than think about the hard questions you're about to face or how mean the interviewer is going to be, think about how you're going to impress them, and think about the job offer they're about to send you next week. The next time you find yourself taking that final penalty kick in the World Cup finals, don't think about how you're going to drop the ball. Think about coming out as the winner and taking it all. Thank you, and good luck.